So the Rebbe asked a question, and I've had this question myself throughout my own life. He asks why the nation of Israel, in our prayers and in our hearts, when we're praying, especially on Yom Kippur, when we feel like we're without any merits left, any personal merits, we dip into the reserves of our forefathers, particularly Abraham, who bound us all in this covenant of Mesirut Nefesh, of self-sacrifice for Hashem. But the Rebbe asks why? Why do we have to dip into Abraham's self-sacrifice? Because, this is what I always thought. There are untold myriads, hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews throughout history who have faced exactly the same sacrifice. The stories of many of them we know, right? But the vast majority of them we don't know. One of the most famous, which came to my mind immediately, and then the Rebbe actually goes on to mention, is the story of Hannah, who encouraged her 7 children to be sent to their torturous deaths rather than to merely bow to a Greek idol. Have you heard the story of Hannah? I remember from when I'm a little boy. And she was known to have proclaimed to them, she shouted to them, "My children, go to Abraham your father and say to him, you bound 1 offering upon the altar, and I have bound 7 offerings." And she was right. There's holocausts, pogroms, inquisitions. It's impossible to imagine how many sacrificed their lives, willingly sacrificed their lives and the lives of their families, rather than give in and compromise on the truth of the one true God. So if that's true, why is it only Abraham's merits that we tap into when there's so many others? And to be fair, many of these others seem to have done so, if we're going to be honest, in more difficult circumstances than even Abraham, because they didn't have this prophetic revelation that strengthened and fortified this unimaginably painful decision. They just had to go based on their intuition and their gut, and they didn't have a divine voice speaking to them. And so that's the question, and the answer that the Rebbe gives is just so beautiful. So here's what he says, and this is the way that the story was presented. The Rebbe brings a metaphor that was passed down from the Hasidic sages, and so this is how it goes. All right, there was an unexplored wilderness that had yet to be traveled through, right? There were no trails. It was just wild, and it seemed untraversable, this wilderness. And there were no maps, of course. There were no markings. No one had ever been there. It had never encountered the sole of a foot. But then one man came, and he accomplished that which not only seemed completely impossible, but no one even dared to try. And he forged a path through this impossible and unexplored terrain. All right, so the metaphor goes on to explain that others, future people, were able to take the same difficult, dangerous, and extraordinarily painful path that this first pioneer forged. But no matter how brutal it seemed, they always had his map to follow. You see where I'm going here? Many of them traversed the path through even more difficult circumstances. While he did it in daylight, maybe the weather was good. They did it at night in stormy weather. Nonetheless, they all recognized that their success in traveling this path was due to his first blazing this trail. And therefore, their tremendous sacrifices were in some way, they were an extension of his own. And so we learn from this that Abraham was the first pioneer of Mesirut Nefesh, of self-sacrifice, true self-sacrifice, in which he was fully willing to sacrifice not only his beloved son, and not only his future and his legacy, but also his mission in the world, the very truth of his message, right? One of the great messages that he had was to these child-sacrificing, idolatrous pagans. And his message was that the one true God of Israel despises child sacrifice. And here he was on the verge of negating that truth of his fundamental message as well. He was willing to sacrifice his son, his future, his message, everything. So he blazed that first trail of self-sacrifice for Hashem. As the masks are coming off and much of the world is turning not only against Israel, but yes, against the Jewish people,
If you feel different, if your love for Israel is growing deeper and stronger, if you're thirsting to cleave to the nation of Israel and to the God of Israel, if you're thirsting to learn authentic Torah from Jews in Judea, then the Land of Israel Fellowship is for you. Hundreds of individuals and families from around the world come together on Zoom every week in what can only be described as a fellowship of love, friendship, of learning and praying and belonging. A fellowship really unlike any other. It's more than just a movement, it's a family. To learn more about the Land of Israel Fellowship, click on www.thelandofisrael.com/fellowship or send an email to fellowship@thelandofisrael.com. Love and blessings from Judea.